I'm Ernie Peixeotto. I entered the Army in 1947, entered the Military Academy at West Point at the time that right after World War II was over. So I'm not a World War II veteran. I'm a veteran of the Cold War because when I graduated from West Point in 1951, the war in Korea was very hot. And my first assignment out of West Point was Korea. On the way to Korea, though, I went to Fort Belvoir, where I went to an officer's basic course, but I was diverted at that time to be a tactical officer at the Officer Candidate School. A tactical officer is the man that leads the candidates and trains the candidates. Had a class of about 40 young men who were training to be officers, and I worked to train them along with many other people, but I was the man in command of them that led them through that. Gave them PT and took them to classes and that type of thing, and ultimately determined whether they were qualified to be an officer or not. So I had the final say on whether they were good enough to be what we call a 90-day wonder. And most of them made it. A few did not because they just did not measure up. So when I finished that tour, I was ready to go to Korea, and I guess the fates of the God were with me. My orders were changed, and I was sent to Panama, where I served with an amphibious support regiment. The regiment was a National Guard regiment that had been called up. If you recall, in Korea, MacArthur had the Incheon landing, in which they outflanked the North Koreans when they were on the Pusan perimeter. And the regiment that I joined was called up to make perhaps another landing further up on the Korean coast. So we served two purposes. We trained amphibious operations on the Caribbean side of the Panama Canal zone, and also provided security for that side of the canal. They had the 33rd Infantry on one side, and we were on the other side. And of course, at that time, many ships, tankers, and everything were going through the Panama Canal to provide supplies for Korea. My tour in Panama terminated when the peace treaty came in Korea, and I was sent to Fort Hood, Texas, where I joined the 1st Armored Division, and I was with the 16th Armored Engineer Battalion there. I am an engineer officer. I was commissioned second lieutenant in the Army Corps of Engineers. And that's why I wound up with an amphibious support regiment, because that's an engineer operation. And so I was with a armored engineer battalion in Fort Hood, Texas, and I wound up as a company commander. When that was over, I was assigned to the district engineer in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And what a change of activity that was, because in that job, I went with the Corps of Engineers work which is called Civil Works, and that's where they do the rivers and harbors work. We were involved with the flood control on the Mississippi, and I was more of a trainee on that assignment. I worked on a hydroelectric dam up in Arkansas. I worked with the workboats down on the Mississippi. I learned all about surveying with survey crews and things like that. So it was a very educational period engineering-wise for me, and certainly helped me in my subsequent assignments as an engineer. When that assignment came to an end, I was really surprised. I was sent to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and it surprised me a little bit because while I did very well in academics at West Point, I didn't think I might make it make the grade to go to MIT, but I was selected to go there and was very honored. I went there to take the civil engineering course. And quite frankly, found when I got there that while West Point was tough, I found that MIT was really tough, and I worked very, very hard there. While I was there, an officer came up from Washington and said, look, I need 2 officers to stay on and study nuclear physics because we need more people to go into the nuclear business. The Cold War was on, the nuclear weapons were really going, and this is when people at schools were hiding under desks and all that type of thing because we were in a potential nuclear war. So, of course, you're taught never to volunteer for anything, but I couldn't pass up the opportunity for the further education. So I did stay on and studied nuclear physics under some of the leading physicists at MIT. My ultimate degree was in civil engineering, but I earned as many credits in nuclear physics as I did in civil engineering, but didn't meet all the qualifications. And by that time, the Army said, hey, we need you. So I was sent to another very interesting assignment with the Atomic Energy Commission. I worked in the Atomic Energy Commission, and our primary activity there was the development of nuclear reactors to generate electric power. I became the project manager, believe it or not, for the first nuclear powered system to generate electricity and put it online. It was before the civilian program accomplished that at Shippingport. But we developed and built a nuclear reactor at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The purpose of that was to build small nuclear reactors to support remote operations. Back then, in the Cold War, we had things called the DEW line, which was a whole series of radars across northern Canada and up in Greenland and so on, and it took huge amounts of gasoline and fuel to keep those people going all winter long. So somebody had made a study and decided that it would be well worthwhile to put small nuclear reactor up there, and then they wouldn't have to supply all that, and it would be cheaper too. Well, we did develop the system, and ultimately we put a reactor up in Greenland in an Iceland tunnel. We provided the Air Force a test one out on a mountaintop in Wyoming. We built another one in Alaska at Fort Greely in Alaska and operated that. And another very interesting one was we placed one in the camp in the Antarctica. And all those systems worked very well and without any difficulty. But the cost effectiveness of it, at that time, gasoline wasn't very expensive. If we were doing it now, they'd probably go gangbusters. But anyhow, the program faded a little bit. So it never came to fruition. But that technology was all there. Well, okay, from there, after working with the Atomic Energy Commission, again, in a long career, you really jump shift here. I got orders to Vietnam. And when I got orders to Vietnam, I said, where is that? Because back in this was late 1958, then I remembered, oh yes, the Viet Minh had just defeated the French at Bien Dien Phu. And the American government had decided, well, we can't let the North Vietnamese take over the South. The South, we had helped establish a government in South Korea under Ngo Dinh Diem, President Ngo Dinh Diem, and we were supporting them. And we were to help build their country, and our purpose was to help build an army for them. So I was one of about 600 advisors in Vietnam to help do that. It was an interesting tour. At that time, the Viet Cong were very active. Many people say, well, when you went there, the war wasn't on, was it? Well, not the war that we knew later, but the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong were very carefully going into all the villages and killing all the leadership. The people in the village would come out in the morning, and there the head guy, his head would be on a post out there. It was a very, very brutal thing. 2 weeks after I arrived, as far as I was concerned, the war opened up. When I arrived, we were under orders that we would not carry sidearms or anything. We were strictly advisors. 2 weeks after I arrived, the Viet Cong attacked one of our we were very small advisory groups, attacked one of them and wiped out everybody there. As a matter of fact, if you go to the wall, the Vietnam Wall in Washington, the first name is a young man called Major Buis, and he is the first official casualty in the Vietnam War of 55,000 or something like that. So it was very interesting. My duty there was to help develop a military academy for the Vietnamese Army. Now here I am, I'm a captain, wet behind the ears, still pretty wet behind the ears, but I'm told to go up to Dalat, Vietnam, up in the mountains, where there was an OCS up there, and the Vietnamese and American government had decided to change that into a military academy. So I went there with an infantry officer, and he ran the military end of it, and I ran the engineering part of it, and I helped to design the curriculum for the academy and design the buildings and got the construction started and all that. I love the Vietnamese people. They were very good. It was a great country. I thought they had a great future. The biggest problem in Vietnam was that the French, God bless them, would not let any of the Vietnamese get any education and leadership. They could rise no higher than clerks. A few in the military had gone to Saint Cyr and so on, and that was kind of the salvation.
Saint Cyr is?
That's the military academy in Paris, the French military academy.
Comparable to our West Point?
Not quite equivalent, but they're equivalent. So the Vietnamese were very good. They were wonderful to work with. And if we just stuck to our guns, we might have been more successful. But anyhow, as that tour went on, I of course was in the field with the Vietnamese and all, and ate with them a lot and so on. And I have to say that their sanitary conditions were not too good. And eventually I came down with amoebic hepatitis, which darn near killed me. And I was in isolation for 6 weeks. They couldn't even evacuate me out of where we were up in Dalat, till finally I was well enough where, actually I would like to make a point here that there was a Christian Missionary Alliance up there, and there was a nurse who took care of the missionaries there, and she saved my life. There was no doctor from the Army or the Navy who would come up to see me, but she saved my life and nursed me back to care where, when I finally was evacuated to the Philippines and saw a doctor there, he said, "You're getting on the first plane back to the States." I was evacuated back to Walter E. General Hospital, where I recuperated.
How long were you in country before you came down for the
18 months.
That was a long tour.
Yes. I was there for 18 months. I would add to this to make it very important. My courageous wife went with me at that time, and we took our 2 children. So we had, under these very arduous conditions, but I had the choice of going with or without, and I gave the choice to my wife, and she said, let's do it. So,
How safe was it for your family over there in '59?
generally safe. On the other hand, there were times of security where we had a platoon of mountain guards around the house where we lived to protect. Intelligence people picked up Viet Cong spies who had our whole schedule on my counterpart and I. They knew exactly when we went to work and what our pattern was. So we were being watched the whole time. So they were in danger. As a matter of fact, at one time we made arrangements to send our children back to the States. And let's see, I think my son was about 5 and our daughter was about 9 when we went over there, somewhere in that time frame. And of course, they have pretty great memories of Vietnam too. They went to the Christian Missionary Alliance School. That's how I got into that. That the Christian Missionary Alliance program, all the children stayed in this area in Dalat, but the missionaries themselves worked throughout Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. They worked out in the villages and so on. A more courageous group of people. I really learned to understand what Christian missionaries really do and how they lay their lives on the line. But most all the other advisors were there on a one-year tour. It was only because of the long-term development of the military academy that I was asked to go for 2 years. And frankly, I said yes, and my wife said yes, and we did it. But the tour came to an end when I was evacuated with amoebic hepatitis. I really believed that we could help to train an officer corps to lead the Vietnamese army, and that was the key to winning over there. See, the French had never let any of those people learn leadership and all. The best the Vietnamese could do in serving in the French army were to be low-level non-commissioned officers and so on. They could never get the higher level of leadership and understand how to fight and how to lead and that type of thing. So it was, I was really sad to leave the job before I could complete my tour. I saw great progress because the United States was bringing in a large amount of tanks and trucks and equipment like that, and they were training on them. They developed the paratrooper units who were very effective. Matter of fact, they became the elite battalions of the Vietnamese Army, like our 82nd Airborne Division is. The infantry units, the actions they had while I was there, they did well. Most of my friends who were advisors with the tactical units spoke fairly well of what they did. The role of the advisors was much more than advising, though. They really had to tell them how to do it and so on, because they just didn't have the seasoned leadership that was needed to field an army at the time. Over time, yes, it developed from years of the war. Because my assignment came up so quickly from the Atomic Energy Commission to go over there, I had no opportunity to study Vietnamese at all. So I was very handicapped without being able to speak directly with them. I had studied Spanish in high school and at West Point, so I was able to get a little pidgin French. Some of the people I worked with who had some education spoke French, but the main thing was to speak through interpreters and things like that. So yes, language was a definite handicap. That's one thing. As we work with countries throughout the world, we do not have enough language-trained people, and Lord knows we found that out in Iraq, where too many people are dependent upon an interpreter to to make the communication. And if you've ever worked through an interpreter, you know that you don't get the direct communication. Sometimes they like to filter what's going on too. There were 600 of us. That was it. 600 advisors, and that was limited by the Geneva Treaty. As a matter of fact, it was so silly in those days. When I arrived in civilian clothes. I was on orders to arrive in civilian clothes because no one was supposed to know how many of us were there, and so on. Of course, we did go to wear uniforms, but they had an inspection of the treaty for the North and South were Polish and Canadians, and they were the inspectors to make sure that the treaty was being enforced. Well, that was a farce. They always looked the other way, particularly when the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong were operating. So it was a treaty that was a piece of paper that wasn't worth the powder to blow it to hell. So it's like too many other treaties we've seen in our lifetime. So let me get on to the next chapter here. When I regained my health from Walter Reed, I went to work for the Office of the Chief of Engineers in Washington, D.C. And I became involved, because of my time in the Atomic Energy Commission, I was put in an assignment of research and development. And I worked there in that office for engineer research and development, where they were doing mine detectors and night vision equipment and new bulldozers and that type of thing. After that assignment, I was moved over to the Pentagon, where I joined the Army staff. And I was back to my experience, I was in the atomics office there. And there I was involved. Here we were still very much in the Cold War. I was involved in the development of artillery shells. For the Army was enabled to fire artillery shells out of the 8-inch and 155 millimeter artillery. And also the development of the atomic demolition munition, which was a small unit like this that we developed to really blow obstacles in Europe when the Russians attacked. The Russians had such an overwhelming superiority in Europe that if they attacked, we had to be able to put obstacles, to blow all the major bridges and blow the railroads and things like that. And the only way to really do it effectively was these small atomic demolitions. So we became very proficient in the design and development of them. Also in that office, I was involved further in the development of nuclear energy, as I had been in the Atomic Energy Commission. But one of the major projects we had going there was the use of fuel cells. Now, you've heard of fuel cells lately. I want you to know that back in the 1960s, the Army was working on fuel cells, and people just couldn't get too excited about it, and it later on got put on the side. But it'd been one of my biggest disappointments that, having been involved in the development of nuclear energy and fuel cells, to see this country wait so long to wake up to realize that we are too dependent upon fuel from the Middle East and so on, whereas we could have had many more nuclear power plants, which are environmentally safer than the carbon dioxide and so on that we have. And we could have really put our money on the development of the fuel cells, which could be in our automobiles now, causing almost environmentally pure operation. So we missed, this country missed great opportunities, and that's why now we should really push this stuff so that future generations have it. Well, that was the problem. And nuclear energy, if you recall, we had the 3 Mile Island incident up in Pennsylvania, which was a non-incident. I mean, yes, there was a little radiation. Then you had the one of the Russians, what's his name?
Chernobyl?
Yes, and that just turned the public off. When you got particularly the environmental culture, and nuclear was bad, and for over 20 years it was bad. What is it? 2/3 of the electric power in France is generated by nuclear power now. So, I mean, we've just been sitting on our haunches while all this happened. So anyway, when I finished that, I went to I left the Pentagon and went to the Command and General Staff College out at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Where incidentally I had been born in Leavenworth, Kansas. I have to add here, my father was an Army officer. I grew up in the Army.
Okay.
And my only interest was to join the Army because I thought it was a wonderful profession, and I greatly admired what my father did. He grew up during World War I and that type of thing. And he was a contemporary of Eisenhower and that type. When I was a kid and we lived in the Philippines, there was MacArthur. Eisenhower was, of course I was a kid, but Eisenhower was his executive or something like that. General Courtney Hodges was a good friend of my folks. Lightning Joe Collins, who led the invasion into Normandy and later on. All those people were in the Army, were in the Philippines at that time. So I was, I thought that was the thing to do, and I was able to do it.
Yeah, was your father a general also?
Yes, he was a brigadier general. He retired as a brigadier general. Mm-hmm. And I would have to add that my grandfather on my mother's side was in the Army too. He was the quartermaster for General Pershing during World War I. So I have a very proud tradition. As a matter of fact, my two older brothers went in the Army too. One went through the Corps of Engineers, and the other was infantry. So we're an Army family. That's
family business.
It's family business. That's right. And I've always said if I had it to do over again, I would do it again. Absolutely. So anyhow, back to the Command General Staff College. That was a year's assignment where basically you are trained to handle staff jobs at the division and higher level. From there, talk about changes here. I went to Iran. At the time, the Shah was still running Iran, and we were advising Iranians. I didn't go over to Iran as an advisor, though. I went there with the Corps of Engineers, and I was a major by this time, and I wound up in the northeastern section of Iran near the city of Mashhad, which is the second holy city for the Muslims, a great place for their migrations. There was an existing airfield there, but when I arrived, we were rebuilding that airfield, tripling its size, making it full concrete, a full air base for the Imperial Iranian Air Force. This was part of our program to build up the Iranians. So, I mean, here were the Soviets right across the border. As a matter of fact, one of my jobs during that period of time was to go up. It was so secret, I was just told to do this. Go up on top of this mountain. I had to drag bulldozers and everything up on top of a mountain, which was right on the border, which is now Turkmenistan, which was the Soviet Union at the time. And from the top of this mountain, you could look over the plains way out there. Well, when we finally got the road and the site built, along came all these people in civilian clothes, pulling several huge trailers. And in these trailers were all kind of electronic equipment. Well, what it turned out to be was it was a spy station to observe the Russian launch facilities of their missile program. I was never told this officially until later on when I was in the Pentagon. I had breakfast with an individual he was an assistant secretary of the Army at the time, but We were comparing notes. Again, the job there was to build this air base. I had an American contractor, but all the subcontractors were Iranians, and that was a very interesting assignment. Very cold winter, but I saw how the people in the Middle East lived, and I learned all about the Muslim world at that time. Very, very, very interesting. I came back from that assignment to again to the Office of the Chief of Engineers, where I was the special assistant to the Chief of Engineers. A pretty interesting job where I worked right outside the door of a three-star general, the man who ran the whole Corps of Engineers. And at that time, Vietnam was really getting hot, and I was involved in a lot of briefings with this three-star general, which were very top secret and so on, about what was going on, and preparing the engineer part of the war to make sure that the right units and supplies and all were going over there. Many other interesting things at the time, like working on a white paper that there was a threat to take the Civil Works program away from the Corps of Engineers and transfer it to the Department of Interior, and I worked on a paper that was used to defend the program before the Congress, to leave it with the Army for all the reasons. I won't go into it now. At the end of that assignment, I went back to Vietnam. And at that time, I went back to command the 86th Combat Engineer Battalion. We were located in the Mekong Delta, which is mostly water, rice paddies, and the Mekong River flowing through there. My battalion was primarily in support of the 9th Infantry Division down there, and we were involved in combat operations throughout the Mekong Delta. I had units as far over as on the Cambodian border, and all the way just south of Saigon, in a town called Tan An.
What's the difference in miles?
My headquarters was in My Tho, and it was about 70 miles south of Saigon. Going west to the Cambodian border was about 100 miles. So we were, for a battalion, we were really stretched out. I had to place a platoon here to do this and a platoon to do that. So it was a really challenge to my people to do these engineer jobs. What were some of the jobs? Building airfields, building helicopter landing sites, because by then the helicopter was the main vehicle for getting around in Vietnam.
Why is that?
Well, the terrain was such that you just couldn't go. So if you were going to have an operation up in this area, see, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, of course, they were very active. They were infiltrating through the plain of reeds and all, and they weren't using roads or anything. They were way in the hinterland. So when we made an enemy sighting or something, we would have to fly in and hit them. In many cases, we had to fight as infantry when the Vietnamese attacked. Always on an engineer job, the combat engineer has a battle plan ready, and if there's an attack, they have their weapons right there and so on, and machine guns in place. So they're ready to do that. Other jobs we did were opening roads. There were large areas of Vietnam, particularly in the Long An province, coming out of Tan An, that the Viet Cong had dominated for years. And our job was to go in and open roads that they had virtually destroyed, and opened those roads so that the farmers could get in there back to their farms, and as we opened the roads, we brought U.S. infantry and Vietnamese infantry units in there to start clearing the Viet Cong out of there. But that was had a lot of casualties in doing that, and a lot of mines on those roads. Once we got a road open, they would come back and mine the road, and we spent a lot of time mine clearing. But that took a lot of work under very difficult conditions, because the Mekong Delta it's just a mud hole. It's just clay and silt, and in the rainy weather, it's what can I say? It becomes very, very muddy. So you have to get the roads up, typical engineering work. You have to build them up and cap them so they're drained, so that nothing comes, water doesn't settle in and weaken the surface. So that was an interesting operation. We had many operations in support of both the 9th Infantry Division, building fire bases. There were bases in which the infantry would put a battalion of troops further out so they could dominate more and more of the area. And we would work with those infantry battalions to do that. We also worked with Vietnamese Army 7th Division. We did a lot of land clearing down there with what we call roam plows, and they would go in and just clean out huge areas. I recall one area we cleaned out where we uncovered the base for a regiment of North Vietnamese. They had lived there, their hospital was there, their ammunition was there. It was full of punji steaks and all kinds of wonderful, wonderful things. We were doing fairly well in there, but I would have to say that we had the elections back in the United States, and of course at that very time we had something similar we see right now. We had a lot of people saying, gee, we ought to get out of Vietnam. We ought to get out of Vietnam. We can't win that war. And Richard Nixon came into office with Henry Kissinger, and unfortunately, one of the first things they did was to negotiate with the North Vietnamese and start writing another one of these bogus peace treaties, which wasn't worth much in my opinion. And ultimately, by by about June of 1969, they announced that, well, we're going to start withdrawing from Vietnam. And my battalion and the 9th Division, which I was supporting in the Mekong Delta, it was decided they would be the first units to be withdrawn from Vietnam. Well, this came as a horrible shock, because what were we going to do to continue the war down there? The war had not been won in the Mekong Delta or in the rest of Vietnam. But the political decision had been made, and we pulled out of there, and of course the history is there. The North Vietnamese Army took over the Mekong Delta within a matter of years. So anyhow, I left Vietnam behind me and came back and went to the National War College in Washington, D.C., spent a year there, and then went on a very interesting tour back to Vicksburg, Mississippi, where I had served as a lieutenant. I was a colonel by now, and I became the director of the Waterways Experiment Station, which is the Army Engineers Research and Development Laboratory, in which what do they do there? All the leading hydraulics laboratories there, the leading soil mechanics, rock mechanics, the leading concrete laboratories, mobility laboratories, weapons effects laboratories, a whole series of civil engineering type of laboratories, where it was my privilege to work with some of the leading civil engineers in the business. And we had as many consultants, top-level people out of the universities and all that came to work with us. So that was a very interesting period of time. Served there for 3 years, and at the end of my tour, I was promoted to brigadier general. And I was then put on orders. I went to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, where I was assistant commandant of the engineer school, and which I was responsible for the training of engineer officers and enlisted men. At the time, the engineer school, the whole engineer center was at Fort Belvoir. Since then, it has been moved to Fort Leonard Wood. Today, it is at Fort Leonard Wood. So that was a very interesting job, and I really enjoyed that and settled down to really manage the school. But about 9 months later, I had a call from the chief of engineers, the 3-star general, and said that I was to move within 2 weeks up to the Pentagon, that the Army staff had been reorganized, and I was going up to be in a new organization called the Deputy Chief of Staff for Research, Development, and Acquisition. I went up there and became the director of planning and programs that put together. This is where my career changed, and I became very involved in planning for the future of the Army. For here's your research and development, and how do you take that, a new tank, for example, and turn that into procurement, and then how do you field it and support it with training and all that. So it was a very, very interesting period of time. At that time, we were involved in the development of systems that are basic in the Army now. The Abrams tank, the Apache helicopter, the Black Hawk helicopter, the Patriot air defense gun, the Chinook helicopter, all those things that you see right now being used to fight the war. We were involved in the development and fielding of that equipment. After a couple of years in that job, the Chief of Staff of the Army moved me, changed my assignment, where I became the Director of the Army Budget. By then I had my 2nd star. I was a Major General in the Army. So here I found myself Director of the Army Budget, which is responsible for like a $50 or $60 billion budget for the Army to not only do the research development, but to pay all the troops and to train the troops and for all the military construction and everything it takes to do that. And that job was to put a budget together, working with the Army staff, and then go over on the Hill before the Senate and the House of Representatives Appropriations Committee to defend it, explain why we needed the money, and answer all their questions, and so on. And you know, that's worth an hour's worth of discussion right there, but that's not too exciting. From there, I went on to, I was assigned to the U.S. Army headquarters in Europe, where I was a senior officer on the staff there. At that time was really a very peak time in the Cold War. See, my whole career spanned the Cold War, and we were getting to the point where the Soviets, they heavily outnumbered us, along with the Warsaw Pact people. We were heavily outnumbered. They were outproducing us in tanks and artillery and things like that. So our only hope was to build up with the modernized forces, and through training and preparation be able to whip them if they ever did attack. And believe me, there were times when I was in Europe when the Soviets moved to the border and it appeared that they were going to attack any day. They were testing us and we were testing them. It was a very dicey period of time. While I was over there, President Ronald Reagan was elected President of the United States, And there was the beginning of the end of the Cold War, because there we had a president that understood what the Cold War was all about. And he started building up the military establishment even more and putting missiles in Europe that, like the Pershing II missile, which could reach way back into the Soviet area where they would mobilize and blast their large units and so on. So he really picked up the Cold War and brought it to the end, and of course that's all history. From my tour in Europe, I came back to the Army and I was promoted to Lieutenant General. That's a 3-star general, and I became the Comptroller of the Army. Now here I started out in the Army to be an engineer and do all that kind of thing, but I wound up as the man who was responsible for all of the Army's money and how it was spent and whether it's misspent and that type of thing. And that job involves working almost on a daily basis with the Congress, working with the Office of Management and Budget, working with the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and so on. So it was a very interesting and challenging job. Because it's in the Pentagon and life in the Pentagon is not nearly as exciting as building an air base in Iran or fighting a war in Vietnam. But I won't go into a lot of details there, but basically I wrapped up my career in August 1984 when I retired and went into, for a few years I worked for a software company and then finally decided to retire. Well, I think one of that has to be commanding a battalion of soldiers in Vietnam for a year during combat. It's a very awesome experience. We had a draft army at that time. We didn't have the volunteer army, so we weren't blessed with the quality of the soldier we have now. But they were good troopers, and they did what they had to do. A lot has been said about the soldiers in Vietnam, and Hollywood's made a lot of movies about the druggies and things like that. That's the anti-war movement does things like that. My troopers were good. The number of drug cases I had in my battalion, I had a battalion well over 1,000 men. They were minimal. There was just not that much drugs and so on. I learned the value of people. In everything I did as a young officer, I learned the value of good people that you work for, that taught you and molded you. And then as I became a leader, going up the food chain here, I learned the importance of good people working for you and taking care of them. Because as a leader, you're no better than the guys and gals working for you. They're going to make you or break you. This is whether it's the Army or a business. And if you don't take care of your people and give them good leadership, then you haven't learned anything. I grew up in the Army. My father was in the Army, so as a youngster, I grew up on Army bases. And I saw what the Army did, and I was very pleased to become a part of it. I thought it was very important to serve my country and to serve the soldiers I worked with. And it's the very, very satisfying thing. I would say that I had the same feeling when I came into the Army as when I left. I was satisfied to be of service. That sounds trite, I know, but that's the way I felt.